Hello, my name is Mauro Canciani, and together with Cecilia Pasalacqua, we'll be telling you a bit about the strategies to integrate a design to GeneXus and how to model files for GeneXus.
This talk will be for designers that want to incorporate GeneXus to new projects, and the goal is to concretely explain what is the modeling process before they're sent to development.
For this, it is key for you to know what is GeneXus and how it works. So here you have a talk that tells you a bit about what GeneXus is. It's also important to know how Figma works and what it is, but it's not a condition for you to know this if you want to see this video, but it is if you want to generate files for GeneXus.
It is important to focus on the fact that design is changing. We have been talking about design system objects for a while, and we have been talking about the atomic design methodology. Incorporating these methodologies generate more structured designs and more maintainable products.
For that, in GeneXus, we have three strategies for well-designed software. First, it is to incorporate design through design systems that you have in GeneXus. In GeneXus 18, we're releasing Unanimo, which is the by default design system with a new KBs in GeneXus. The new strategy is to use the systems that your partners develop to extend and accelerate design development in GeneXus. And the third one is to implement design by hand. To do that, we have this input from design, which is a tool that we'll be telling you a bit about in this talk. If you want to know more about the first two strategies that I mentioned, you can take a look at my talk with Federico Salomon or the talk given by Eugenio and Fabian. If you want to know more about how to use our partners' tools, you can take a look at Federico's talk or Sofia and Joaquin's talk.
To implement this strategy of incorporating external designs from the 17th GeneXus version, we are developing the import tool that allows us to incorporate designs from Figma and Sketch. Now, even if we understand that incorporating this tool generates new processes for work and new dynamics, we also understand that the big advantage is that the products that we will create in the future will be more manageable. We should note that in the same way that designers are responsible for designing, modeling, and sending files, developers at the GeneXus level have to import and implement those files. And that, of course, generates a situation of iteration between design and developers. So designers and developers will be connected until the moment where we get our final product. Now, if you want to know more about this iteration process, you can see this talk. Now, through these 4 stages, we will be hearing more about the modeling design for files prior to sending them to the GeneXus developers. We will see what are the different tools used, what are the different models that we need to work on, what are the conventions that we need to bear in mind with developers, and what are the methods for sharing. Initially, we need to define what are the tools we will use. As we mentioned in the introduction, the tools supported at this point with GeneXus are Figma and Sketch. They are both vector prototyping tools, but the difference is that Sketch is only compatible with Mac, whereas Figma is agnostic and it is compatible with any OS. It is also a tool that does not require an external plugin, as is the case with Sketch. Both are available to import in GeneXus, and we consider that Figma is the one that offers more features in terms of sharing different files. Now, all the skills necessary that you need to work with those tools are here in the dashboard that you have here, where we have conventions for developing and good practices and resources for the optimization of your files.
Now we'll be going through the fundamentals that we need to take into account to model files for GeneXus. But before, we need to clarify something. For files to be effectively imported, we need to consider 2 points. First, we need to keep our design as simple as possible. This doesn't mean that GeneXus supports basic designs and only basic designs, but the easier it is, the easier the import will be. The second thing is to keep your files tidy and neat. So as you design, try to make adjustments as you go. The first thing to adjust a file for GeneXus is that the file should be modeled and componentized with a design system. This is important because when you incorporate that file in GeneXus, all that information and all that knowledge that appears in that file will be automatically transferred to GeneXus. That's why it is important to adjust layer styles. Also, you need to adjust tokens, design styles, and to componentize and systematize the file as much as possible.
What used to be good design practices are now essential and have a direct impact on product maintainability. Now, the next thing is to make different modelings and adjustments to bear in mind prior to sharing the product with the developer. This is an example. We have two screens that look exactly the same visually, but the modeling of the document is fully different. The example in the left is correctly systematized and it uses all the adjustments that we will mention later on. And on the contrary, the example on the right does not bear in mind any of the recommendations. So when we are importing in GeneXus these two files, we see that the result is fully different and it becomes evident that we need to correctly structure the document to import, not just because it should reflect the design, but also for maintainability and updating. Now we will carry out the different adjustments that are necessary for a design file.
The first adjustment to take into account is to use conventions defined for GeneXus. So you need to use these conventions to give more information to GeneXus about what you want to do with your file. For instance, we could talk about a button. If in Figma you draw a rectangle with some text, that for us that is a button, GeneXus cannot interpret that as a button. So you need to follow the convention that we have in GeneXus to determine and define what a button is. So when you group those two elements and in the layer's name you write button and the name of the button, in that way GeneXus will interpret that as a button and it will be modeled as such. The second thing is how you work with icons and images. You need to share all the images and icons with developers. That in GeneXus, the import is done automatically, but you need to choose all the icons and images as exportable. You can use icons as SVGs or with different densities, ×1, ×2, and ×3 for different platforms. So it's important to understand that GeneXus does not support vectorials. That needs to be grouped and exported as image. The third thing to bear in mind is the grouping and use of order layouts. You need to define the structure of the file following these conventions for layers and groups. That's why we have a tutorial for that we mentioned before. It's important to use grouping to define the different components in a screen. And you need to avoid having an excess of groups and layers so that you don't have repeated elements in GeneXus. The fourth point is to rename all elements. By default, Figma and Sketch will assign layers names as the content of the elements that you're using. All that information gets to GeneXus and then developers need to work with that. So it's really important to keep layers that are consistent with the content. I mean, names of those layers. As you see, these images with images, groups, icons, frames, they need to be consistent with the content. And these names should be agreed together with the GeneXus developer when there is no pre-established convention. Another important thing is to adjust responsiveness. It's important to define all the elements so that responsiveness happens in the element of design. So whatever happens in design will happen again when you import it to GeneXus and in the final development platform.
In this point, we recommend changing the size of the frame manually to see how the different elements behave in the different screen sizes. If at that point you detect a mistake, you can correct it directly using Figma or Sketch for anchoring or fill containers until it behaves in a responsive way. In the case where you need to have multi-device products, we can create different layouts using Figma or Sketch. And if you want to know the specific conventions for that, you can consult the following material.
The last point to bear in mind is that we can define navigation between screens in our design. So GeneXus will respect all the interactions that we define. In Figma, it only respects the on-click action. And it's a really good way of having functional prototypes really fast in GeneXus.
Going back to the modeling process, the next point are conventions with developers. We should bear in mind that we need to have a good relation with developers where we understand their work environments. We need to be ahead of what those developers are expecting out of our files, and that is why it's fundamental for us to review the design checklist included in the dashboard, especially paying attention to the mandatory aspects. The import file should be modeled so that most design decisions are defined, not leaving any room for free interpretation by developers. Because in many cases, we will come across aspects that cannot be defined or are not supported by GeneXus, and we should talk about that with developers. A recurring case for that is the behavior of a button, because we cannot define that behavior in Figma or Sketch when we are pressing it or hovering over it, but we can create a component for each stage and talk to the developers so that they know when to assign each style to the behavior of the button. We should also remember that this is an iterative process and that we will hardly arrive at the expected result in our first trials. And for this to be effective, we should, of course, incorporate this file preparation process. We should bear in mind recommendations and adjustments, but we also should have a fluent communication with developers. In many cases, that communication will allow us to decide when we should continue correcting and iterating, and when it is better for that modification to happen at the level of the code by the GeneXus developer. And once we have completed the last stage of the process, we have to share the process, and we will share it based on the tool we use. If we use Figma, we can simply share the URL with the developer, first freezing a version of Figma. Although it's ideal for us to have made all the decisions prior to sending the file, we know that last-minute changes can always take place. And if we make those changes over that file that we are sending to the developer, we can create a conflict. So we should try to freeze a version and share that version with the developers. And the other point is that we should consider fonts. When GeneXus imports an external design, it looks for those fonts in Google Fonts. So if we're using fonts that are not in that platform, we need to share them in OTF or TTF format so that they can install them in their computers prior to importing. If you're using Sketch, we need an external plugin to import into GeneXus, and if you want to know how to download it, install it, and export files, you can use the information here. Now, once you have sent the file, we have completed the modeling in GeneXus. And in summary, we can say that this modeling process does not have a direct impact on the visual design of the file that we're sending, but it does have a direct impact on the maintainability of the generated product. And following these 4 stages, considering that this is an iterative process, considering the different adjustments and the close relation with developers, we will lower the time of developing.
If you want to know more about this methodology and to learn about the conventions and necessary skills, please visit genexus.com/DesignOps.